Hey folks, and welcome back. So this week we are going to be talking about utilitarianism, the broad ethical theory that says that we ought to act in ways that are conducive to bringing about the greatest happiness for the greatest number. Utilitarians call this the greatest happiness principle. It comes from the work of John Stuart Mill and Jeremy Bentham. I'm going in these couple of videos that I post, I'm going to talk mostly about applying utilitarian thinking to business ethics in particular, rather than giving you a background on utilitarianism, because I've already asked you to watch a number of YouTube videos that give you just that background. So if you haven't seen those videos, head back over there, check those out, then come back here and watch these videos on utilitarianism in a business ethics context, because it's only on the basis of those videos that you'll be able to understand what's going on here. I'm not going to give you that background. All right, so let's start thinking about utilitarianism, right? Utilitarianism says that we ought always to act in such a way that our actions tend to bring about the greatest good for the greatest number. We ought to try to maximize pleasure on the whole and minimize pain or suffering on the whole. And this seems like a really intuitive, nice way to think about ethics. We ought to think about how our actions affect other people. And for the utilitarian, it's actually very broad, right? It's not just how those actions affect us, though that matters. It's not just how it affects our family and friends or our broader social networks or our society as a whole. It's all of humanity. And in fact, it's even broader than that. Utilitarians say, many utilitarians think that we ought to consider whether our actions generate more pleasure or pain for all sentient creatures, any beings that can feel pleasure and pain. Their pleasure matters, their pain matters. The pain and suffering of the tiniest little chipmunk that can feel pain and suffering matters. It might not matter the same as the pain and suffering as a human being, but it matters. Causing suffering for them is not a good thing, even though sometimes it might be justifiable. So how do we apply this in the business ethics context? What are some of the nuances of bringing utilitarianism to bear in business ethics? Well, at a surface level, you might think that there's a very nice fit between business ethics and utilitarianism, because in business, we make decisions on the basis of cost benefits and benefit analysis. Right? We add up all the costs of an action, we add up all the benefits of an action, and we decide to do the actions that lead to the greatest benefit for the cost. Utilitarians are saying basically the same thing. Add up all the pleasures, add up all the pains. If the pleasures outweigh the pains, go for it. That's a good action. Aim for those actions that are conducive to creating the greatest happiness for the greatest number. And on the surface, that seems right. But in business, we tend to think of cost-benefit analysis in a very egoistic way. It's about the cost and benefits for me or for my business, for my corporation, my firm, not about the cost and benefits for society as a whole. Who am I to think about the costs and benefits for society as a whole? So there is some tension here, right? Utilitarianism is not just saying do the normal cost-benefit analysis. It's saying we've got to think about the cost and benefits for the whole. Think about how a business's actions are going to affect everyone across the board. And there's another puzzle here as well. We don't often think that businesses ought to make all of their decisions on the basis of acting in such a way that their actions will create the greatest good for the greatest number. We think, and we're going to get into this later in the semester, we think that they sometimes can make decisions in a very self-interested way, that they ought to do what's best for their bottom line, or that what creates the greatest return for their shareholders. They have no need to think about, in many cases, what's going to be in the social good. They might face certain constraints that they ought not to act against the social good, but in many cases we think they ought not to make decisions just on the basis of what they think will be conducive to the common good or the good of humanity. Rather, they ought to make decisions on the basis of what will be in their own best interest and their shareholders' best interest. So there's a kind of tension here that we need to explore. There's a question about whether utilitarianism really fits in a business ethics context, whether it really gives us a framework for making ethical decisions in a business context. And to see why it might, we need to take a sort of broader view of things. We need to start thinking, in fact, at three distinct levels: the level of the individual, the level of the firm, and the level of the economy as a whole. Once we start thinking at those three levels about how utilitarianism might work, we can see how it might function as an ethical framework for business. Gustafson says that utilitarianism fits business well if we conceive of business as a means of transforming culture and society, and utilitarianism is the ethical perspective which most easily helps us to address the ethical relationship and responsibilities between business and society. Surely, he says, nothing is more powerful than business itself in shaping our cities, our work, our environments, our playing environments, our values, desires, hopes, and imagination. Business provides great goods for society through goods and services, jobs, tax revenue, and even common outcomes, but also has wide-ranging effects on a broad spectrum of stakeholders. Utilitarianism, he thinks, gives us a framework for understanding the relationship between those benefits that businesses give to society and the broader effects that they have on society, both good and bad. And so he's right. Businesses do shape our lives. They shape our lives intimately. Your job, the other businesses that you interact with on a daily basis, the industries and corporations that developed your community, the places where you live. All of this has been shaped by business. Your desires, your interests have been shaped by business. Right? If you like the Philadelphia Eagles, I'm sorry because they're having a rough start. But if you like the Eagles, that's a business shaping your interest. They've sold that to you, to your family, to your community, and feed off of that interest. So businesses play just a vital role in our lives, and Gustafson says utilitarianism helps us think about the relationship between businesses and society more broadly. So how's that work? How could we do that? Well, let's start at the level of the individual. Right? At the level of the individual, individuals sometimes in a business context might make their decisions on the basis of utilitarian thinking. Right? They might think about the consequences of their actions or have certain rules of thumb that they follow that they think will, in general, tend to bring about the greatest good for the greatest number. But they often find themselves in business contexts where those rules of thumb don't apply, where they ought not to follow those rules, or they're asked to break those rules. They might find themselves in business contexts where they're asked to withhold information that they otherwise would feel compelled to share, or where they're asked to stretch the truth in some way, or to be somewhat deceitful in a negotiation context in order to get the upper hand for their firm, in order to do what is right for their shareholders or for their company, and not allow another company or another corporation to interfere with them achieving their goals. Individuals in many cases are asked to compromise what we might think of as their normal rules of thumb or ethical principles. Not necessarily their core principles. They might still have core principles of honesty, integrity, that they continue to follow. but fairness that they continue to follow. But they might be asked to sort of stretch them to fit the business context sometimes. And in other social settings, stretching those rules in that way would in fact not tend to bring about the greatest good for the greatest number. Right? So business requires of us a violation of these principles that we think we ought to follow to bring about the greatest good for the greatest number. And it seems okay in that setting. Right? It doesn't seem to be a violation of the moral code in that setting. So we have a puzzle here, right? We have to figure out why it is that it's sometimes acceptable to act against the principles that one would normally act on, the utilitarian principles that one would normally act on when you're in a business context. Let's jump to the level of the firm. Firms also face constraints, right? There are ways in which they should not behave because those are not conducive to the greatest good for the greatest number. And we can explain why they ought not to do certain things because they're not conducive to the greatest good for the greatest number. So firms may be able to make a cheaper product that they can sell to more people, that makes more people happy, that provides more people with a service, that enriches their shareholders if they are allowed to pollute indiscriminately or to damage the environment in other ways. That's possible, right? But we tell firms that they can't do that, or we think that when they skirt the rules, the legal rules, in order to do that, they've done something morally wrong. And we can understand that in utilitarian terms because the long-term effects of or consequences of their polluting actions are detrimental to the well-being of the whole. They're detrimental to the well-being of many, many people in our society, while and at some point that disutility that they bring about, that harm that they cause, outweighs the utility that is gained by allowing them to pollute. And it's at that tipping point where we begin to say, whoa, 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 the pollution is a problem. You should not be doing that. It is harmful. So utilitarianism explains some of these constraints on business behavior. But we run into the same problem at the level of the firm as we saw at the level of the individual. Because there are some behaviors that corporations, that businesses engage in that we think in other contexts would not be acceptable. They're allowed to be deceitful in negotiations. They're allowed to be cutthroat in business. They're allowed to try to undermine their competitors. They're allowed to do anything that's within the legal limits to get a competitive edge in the markets that they are in. And we think that in other contexts, such actions would not be allowed precisely because they would not be conducive to the overall well-being. They seem anti-cooperative. And we think that cooperation is key to generating greater good for the greater number in most social contexts. And if you act in ways that are deceitful or that are cutthroat competitive, you are not acting in a cooperative way, and you're going to end up leading to greater harm rather than good overall. But in a business context, that's sometimes called for. So again, we see this same puzzle. Businesses are allowed to act in ways, even encouraged to act in ways that would be detrimental in other contexts. Why? Well, we can only understand why when we look at the level of the economy as a whole. Right? We have a market-based economy. We structure our economy around competitive markets. And if we think that structuring our economy around competitive markets is the way to structure an economy that leads to the greatest good for the greatest number, that leads to the best outcomes, the greatest overall happiness, then that justifies all of these other practices within a business context. We can understand business as a practice, as almost like a game that we play that is governed by a different set of rules than the rest of our lives. And it's governed by that different set of rules because when it's governed by that set of rules, as a practice, it leads to better outcomes. Right? So we allow it to act differently than, and allow people in business settings to act differently than in other contexts, because when they're playing that business game, when they're in that context, it leads to better outcomes for them. Or not just for them, for everyone, for the society as a whole. Now, if you think that market economies don't lead to the greatest good for the greatest number, if you think that that's in fact not true, then that justification falls away, right? Then you think that the sorts of things that businesses do and that people engaged in business practices do that are specifically allowed within business but not outside of business, you'd think that those behaviors are in fact morally problematic behaviors, even in that business context, because you think the practice as a whole is unjustified. You think there's no reason for allowing these deviations from the more cooperative principles of society. So it helps us then to think about ethics at these three distinct levels within business. And the utilitarian framework gives us a way of doing that. It gives us a way of saying, okay, at this big picture societal level, market economies lead to the greater good for the greater number. And so we can structure businesses and competitive markets in such a way that some of the behaviors within them in other contexts would not lead to the greatest good. But when they're in that context, they end up leading to the greater good for the greater number. All right, I'm going to wrap this lecture up here, and I'll pick up in the next one talking a little bit about some of the problems that have been raised in the business ethics literature for utilitarianism.